Yo, what's up, guys? I'm LeLe Farley, a bilingual comedian and rapper based out of Los Angeles, California, and banned in the People's Republic of China. Today, I want to talk about a very important question. Should you still learn Chinese?
你应该知道，我这么帅的只会出现在动漫。要想明白你是不是我标准的共犯？我知道
儿子，咱们还是别说中文，咱们先假装是韩国人啊。
안녕하세요.
Last July, I drove with my Uyghur homie Inti to Mike Pompeo's speech on China and the Communist Party. Inside the heavily guarded Richard Nixon Library, Pompeo declared U.S. policy towards China a failure. Outside the library, I donned a Winnie the Pooh onesie and for the first time in my life experienced open political discussion in Chinese with Chinese people.
我现在非常开心，因为这个应该算是我人生中第一次可以跟中国人非常自由地聊政治。
Having studied Mandarin for over a decade, this kind of atmosphere was intoxicating. Up until then, my language journey had been starved of honest exchange and open discussion, especially when it came to politics, something I'm sure my fellow Chinese learners know all too well. Actually, my inbox is full of Westerners telling me that my content makes them want to start or resume learning Mandarin. And though I've covered the linguistics behind efficient Mandarin study, I've yet to address the elephant in the room. Given everything that's going on with the world and China, should you still learn Chinese? It's a huge decision to learn any language. As a kid growing up in Texas, I learned Spanish for 5 years and sucked at it. To this day, I still only remember one sentence. Yo tengo un gatos en mis pantalones. Yeah. So when I started high school, I said hasta luego to Español and chose Chinese. Why? Because I thought the characters looked cool and I needed to satisfy my school's language requirement. I had no clue that decision would one day hurl me into the center of the biggest geopolitical conflict of the 21st century. Choosing which language to invest your time in should absolutely factor in the current political climate. And it's no secret that China, once viewed with excitement and wonder, is now one of the least liked countries in the world. Do things like COVID, the Hong Kong protest, or prison camps in Xinjiang turn you off from learning Chinese? Or does a 1,000-year-old history mixed with the aesthetic value of Chinese characters pull you back in? In 2021, should you still learn Chinese? Well, the most important question to ask yourself is why? Why do you want to learn? There's no right or wrong answer here. Believe me, in my 12 plus years of learning Mandarin, I've heard them all, with the most common being international business, followed by Asian fever or romance, or trying to become China famous. Let's break these down.
其实我身边的亲戚好友们也经常会来问我，哦，你是经济系出身的，你是美国 Top 20大学毕业的，并且你会说中国话，那你将来肯定能够赚很多钱。
Is this true? Can learning Chinese open up doors for you to make bank in international business?
实际上并不如此，因为中文就是太难学，太难学了。
The short answer is probably not. The long answer is depends how good your Chinese is. Let's say you work at an international firm in China. Most of your coworkers will still be Chinese, and for them to beat out the competition, they typically need to speak a competent level of English, especially for non-IT jobs. And guess what? Unless your Mandarin is already advanced, they're only going to speak to you in English.
待たせたな。こいつがお望みのフルパワーだ。
終わりだ、フリーザ。
フルパワーだ。
But let's say you're like me, you studied Chinese in undergrad and even did a year of postgrad language study. Unfortunately, you're probably still only somewhere between intermediate and advanced. That's the reason Chinese is one of the world's hardest languages to learn. It starts out hard, gets much harder, and then once you got about 4,000 or 5,000 characters under your belt, it finally gets easier. So, though you may have sunk years into learning Mandarin, your Chinese colleagues are probably still only going to speak English with you. After all, they've studied since elementary school. And this is assuming you actually find a job. In China, most firms will only give work visas to foreigners with 2+ years of work experience. So if you're looking to get a job in China right after university, your choices are slim to none. Unless you want to teach English, in which case, you don't need to know Chinese. You just need to be white. Just kidding. But seriously. Now what about so-called Asian fever? I get this question a lot.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm using Tanzan is for Chinese.
Personally, I don't think you should limit yourself to one race. Not just sexually, but like in all of life. Seriously, multiculturalism is the effing truth. F all that cultural appropriation bullshit. The best flavors of life come from mixing, okay? It's a biological fact. You know, Country and Trap, Peanuts and Chocolate, or Blake Griffin. Human race's optimal state is when we blend, so we should all just bang each other. But seriously, I mean, like, you're allowed to have your own sexual preferences, and other people should not infringe on that. But If one of your main goals in learning Mandarin Chinese is to hook up with Asian girls, you're better off learning Korean. It's way easier than Chinese and boasts a much better selection of entertainment to learn from. Now, what if you're trying to hook up with Asian dudes? Well, you might be in luck. Many of the best Mandarin speakers I know were gay dudes super into Chinese guys. Seriously, in China there are 2 talk shows that invite the best Mandarin-speaking foreigners from around the world to come share their opinions on popular culture. As someone that's auditioned for these shows twice and failed twice, I've met and know many of these dudes, and a huge proportion of them are gay. Quick side note here, right before COVID broke out, I actually did get invited to join one of these shows, but I didn't check my inbox for months, and by the time I saw it, I had already started posting political satire on YouTube, effectively getting myself banned in the People's Republic of China. Funny how things work out, right? Now, as a student of economics, I know correlation does not imply causation. Just because world-class Mandarin proficiency is highly correlated with homosexuality, that doesn't mean they necessarily cause each other. Especially when you consider the fact that these guys work in entertainment, where, especially in China, gay men are much more prevalent. Still, can your sexual desires help fuel your studies through the long, girthy, sweaty grind of Chinese? Definitely. But in my personal experience, a sincere friendship is an infinitely more effective source of motivation. My 2 best Chinese bros barely spoke any English, so our relationship pinned entirely on my language progression.
Oh my god, that was so sick. He looks healthy to me. Why are you calling him sick?
That pressure fueled me way more than attraction to any female. Well, except one, but that's a story for another time. Unfortunately for their personal safety, we've had to cut all communication. Why is that? Well, because China has entered into a second cultural revolution. Now, what do I mean by second cultural revolution? Well, in the title of this video, Should You Still Learn Chinese? The still is essential because 10 plus years ago, learning Chinese was the fashionable thing to do. Yes, back then there were both pros and cons, but the pros typically outweighed the cons because most people thought China was the next global powerhouse, with a burgeoning middle class pushing the country towards democratization. Hell, even China's premier Li Keqiang said so as recently as 2013. But now, Xi Jinping has canceled presidential term limits, centralized power, crushed dissent, and stoked the flames of nationalism, all in an attempt to divert attention from him and his party's failures. This is exactly what Mao Zedong did following the catastrophe that was the Great Leap Forward. I'm going to try and keep this brief, otherwise the video will be like an hour long. The Great Leap Forward was a 5-year plan of forced agricultural collectivization and rural industrialization instituted by the CCP in 1958. Mao started off by outlawing private enterprise in the countryside. Then he strips his peasants of all possessions and property.
Mao sets impossibly high production targets for these collective farms. And the peasants are told they won't receive food rations if they don't hit their quotas.
During that time, the party favored ideological purity over expertise, leading local officials to lie about their low crop yields in fear of persecution. Some went as far as propping out cutouts of healthy farmers, placing them with enough distance from the road to fool officials during inspections. Meanwhile, their village was literally starving to death. Led by Mao, the Great Leap Forward resulted in a sharp contraction of the Chinese economy and between 30 and 55 million deaths. The largest single non-wartime campaign of mass killing in human history. Yeah, and he's still on the f***ing currency. Instead of reform, Mao doubled down on communism and initiated the Cultural Revolution, a 10-year purge that makes the Salem witch trials look like Sex in the City. From 1966 to 1976, Mao centralized power and called upon the youth to purge Chinese society of what he called capitalist elements. Schools closed, university exams were canceled, and intellectuals suffered from such severe public humiliation and torture, those that weren't executed were often driven to suicide, including, of course, the country's leading scientists and scholars. Death tolls for the Cultural Revolution vary widely, from a couple 100,000 to 20 million. Yeah, the Cultural Revolution was absolutely bonkers, and if you're interested in knowing more about it, check out the links in my description below. Now let's come back to 2021. Is China in another cultural revolution? And how does that affect your decision to learn Chinese? First, let's point out the obvious. Both periods have one-man rule, cult of personality, rampant nationalism used to distract from the party's failures, inefficient allocation of resources, state interference in all private industry, local officials inflating numbers to appease their leader, public intellectuals persecuted for speaking out, students reporting on teachers and fellow classmates, and, of course, the arts being turned into a tool of propaganda, stifling the country's creativity while promoting state-sponsored entertainment. Ah yes, any good dictatorship needs a clear enemy to serve as a scapegoat. a conceptual punching bag for its citizens to lash out on, a medium through which to vent their rage. So when Beijing-born director Chloe Zhao won a Golden Globe for No Man Land, a film highlighting the difficulties of poverty in America, you'd think China would be all about that. And they were. Until screenshots from a 2013 interview surfaced where she said, "It goes back to when I was a teenager in China, being in a place where there are lies everywhere." Also, she was misquoted as saying the US is now my country instead of the US is not my country, adding fuel to the already raging fire. 8 years into Xi Jinping's now unlimited term, nationalist fervor is in full swing. Over the course of a few hours, comments online about Chloe and her film went from extremely positive and encouraging to angry and downright hostile, with many saying she's humiliated the Chinese people, or what's known as 辱华. So what's happening here and what's it got to do with learning Chinese? Well, 辱华 is a term that blurs the line between people, country, and government, thrown at people like ex-Houston Rockets GM Daryl Morey when he tweeted support for the Hong Kong protest. Despite deleting the tweet moments later, it was enough to put the NBA's entire China business at risk. Obviously, it's a bit of an overreaction, but at the core of 辱华 is what many people call the 玻璃心, or the glass heart of Chinese society. It's fragile and shatters with even the slightest bit of criticism. In fact, I'm sure I've already shattered a few during this video. With roots in Confucianism, Chinese traditional culture emphasizes subservience to authority over challenging it. Think grandma just said something stupid? Too bad, kid. You better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. Think your teacher is contradicting himself and you want to let him know? Oh, sorry, but I don't remember giving you permission to speak. You want to explore the farthest reaches of consciousness and major in philosophy? Well, honey, it is your choice. And your choices are pre-law, pre-med, and accounting. None of this is new to Chinese people, by the way. In fact, in his 1918 short story, Diary of a Madman, my favorite Chinese author Lu Xun outlines the insidious effects of traditional culture on Chinese society. The story's narrator progressively slips into madness as he sees cannibalism in both his family and village. Upon carefully examining the Confucian classics, he begins to see the words "eat people" written between the lines. The story ends with the famous line, "Save the children." He felt criticism and reform of traditional ideology was a vital step into changing national character, essential in redeeming what he saw as the spirit of the Chinese people. Don't ask questions, shut the f*** up and do what I say isn't new in Chinese culture. But it would be a gross overgeneralization to think everyone holds these values, especially in modern-day China. Before Xi came to power, the CCP actually allowed a surprising amount of criticism. I still remember a China where political commentators commanded huge Weibo followings. Openly gay students led their university's Communist Youth League, and artists contributed biting social commentary to public discourse. During the period before Xi, the party, the country, and the people were rapidly gaining confidence as China was pitted to be the next big thing. Studying in China at the time felt like what I'd imagine America was like in the 1950s. Opportunities were everywhere, with an overwhelming sense of excitement in the air. Sure, there were problems, but most people I spoke to, including foreigners, felt the country as a whole was moving in the right direction. That spirit, that was the China that I fell in love with. One that fades more into memory with each passing day. Just like Mao, Xi Jinping is unfit to lead China. And just like Mao, Xi's brought back strongman rule. He fuels the fires of nationalism to brainwash the youth and crush dissent. So when Chloe Zhao, an award-winning Chinese-born director, makes history as the first Asian woman to win a Golden Globe for Best Director, she's labeled a traitor. This is modern China. This is why the title of the video reads, "Should you still learn Chinese?" Now, there's still one reason I haven't covered for why people want to learn Chinese, and that's to become China famous. Starting in the 1980s with Canadian comedian Da Shan, a steadily growing number of mostly Caucasian men have achieved great fame in China. With the emergence of social media, foreign vloggers flooded the Chinese internet, making careers out of eating spicy food, commenting on cultural differences, or singing Mando pop. But around 2016, a new sort of foreign vlogger appeared, what's known as the Using this term will get me demonetized on YouTube, but if you're interested, I made a song by the same name. You can check it out in the link below. For now, we'll call them CCP shills. These guys often don't speak Chinese, relying simply on their European appearance and complete lack of shame to make it big. and I mean fortunes, regurgitating CCP rhetoric. They assure Chinese people that Western media is unfair, that despite not speaking Chinese themselves after living there for over a decade, they somehow understand China better than guys like me or LeLe, guys that have dedicated huge chunks of our lives to learning the language, befriending the people, and exploring the culture. When you're raised in a society that doesn't allow criticism, you view criticism as an attack, an attempt to humiliate. But without criticism, your country and people cannot grow. Innovation suffocates as ideas die before ever seeing the light of day. Trust me, from my personal experience, I can tell you, if you want to become China famous, learning Chinese will only hold you back. As is true with any language, the better you get, the more you'll understand the culture. But Chinese fluency enables you to see the profoundly negative impact the CCP has on China and the Chinese people. You become a witness in the lost potential of what could be magnificent. So if this is all true, then why? Why do I continue to learn Chinese? Simply put, because Chinese is fucking dope. Sharing nothing in common with Indo-European languages, Chinese builds you a completely unique frame of thinking through which to perceive the world. Characters represent ideas more than concrete words, giving rise to centuries of brilliant poetry. 20-character Tang Dynasty poems require pages of English translation, and even then, you still feel like something's missing. And as your ears begin to discern between the tones of Mandarin, you can enjoy the melodic cadence professional orators work years to perfect. You can feel the relaxed nature of a Chengdu accent exude from the local speech. You can embrace the irreverent boldness of a Beijing accent, getting drunk on rice wine with a bunch of old men while chilling in the labyrinth of ancient alleyways known as hutong. You can befriend enthusiastic locals that don't speak a word of English, yet remain tremendously curious about you and the outside world. You can even channel your frustrations with the Communist Party through satire. Try to reach out to those trapped within the Great Firewall and tell them you are not alone. You can try and be a force for the change that you want to see in the world. So, if you're looking to experience a wild roller coaster ride of a life, then hell yeah, you should learn Chinese. I'm LeLe Farley. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Peace. Oh, also, I heard Taiwan's pretty dope, too, so there's that.
一帮教父白天到处都跑去，生活困苦却一路欢声笑语。在网上他们期待感那一描述，终于可以静下来去湖边一起钓鱼。不回家，一夜一夜做到天亮，寒彻机械骤雨出现，天气变凉。